Hi there, Mark Jaben here, Medical Director for the Haywood County Health Department, and let's talk about this pandemic. In the last video, we talked about the end of the recent World Series. And a player pulled late in that game because his COVID test had returned positive, and then went out on the field to celebrate, exposing his teammate and others. And it reminded me it's a good time to talk about testing again. So to review, there are three kinds of tests for COVID. First is a PCR test, which detects the genetic material of the virus. Second, the antigen tests, which detect proteins on the surface of the virus. And third, antibody tests, which detect the body's immune response. Now, we've talked about these antibody tests before. They do not play a role in either the diagnosis or in treatment decisions. So PCR has been the standard test, and although there is a rapid PCR that takes a few hours, the most accurate is a send-off test. But these can take days to return, currently in the range of 2 to 4 days. And that's apparently what Major League Baseball has been using, and why there was a delay to getting this player's results. Now, antigen tests are attractive because the result comes back in 15 to 30 minutes. And you've probably heard a lot about these lately. The federal government has supplied these to long-term care facilities, and Governor Cooper this past week announced supplying them statewide. There are also several urgent cares in our area that have been using these tests over the past few months as well. But these antigen tests are not as accurate as PCR. They leave open the risk of a false negative test, meaning it says you don't have the disease when in fact you do and are contagious to others. And there's also a risk of false positives, meaning you don't have the disease, but the test says you do. There is, however, a place for antigen tests, but only in certain situations. So first, if you have concerning symptoms within the first 5 days of onset, then a positive antigen test probably means you are infected. And this is the only circumstance where a single antigen test result is reliable. Any other result in any other circumstance tells you nothing. You don't know any more than you knew before you took the test. So don't be misled. But let's look at a couple of other situations. Let's say you have symptoms for less than 5 days and you get a negative result. You're free and clear, right? Wrong. A negative antigen result in someone with concerning symptoms is too likely to be a false negative. You would be misled into thinking you are not infected. And in this case, a PCR test has to be done to confirm the result. Second, you have concerning symptoms, but it's been more than 5 days. In this case, an antigen test, whether positive or negative, is not to be trusted. Have a PCR done. Third, you don't have any symptoms, but you know you were exposed to someone who is positive. In this case, a single antigen test does not help, but doing serial antigen tests every 3 days or so might be a helpful strategy. And it has to do with this, the level of the virus, and when it has replicated enough for the test to even be able to detect it. In other words, if done too early or too late, the test would not be capable of detecting the virus that's there. There just isn't enough around. But done every few days, you could hopefully pick up the peak of that viral load. And fourth, no symptoms and no known exposure. In this case, you'd have to test every few days, every week to be helpful. And that's what's happening in many of the long-term care facilities with use of the antigen test. So back to the LA Dodgers and the player who tested positive. His testing was part of a screening process. He had no symptoms and no known exposure. So this was like an example, the last example that we had. This was a PCR test that was done, so there was a delay to get results. So playing the game was okay. But in every other example, a person should quarantine while awaiting results. If he had had symptoms or a known exposure, he should never have played in that game. And his actions after the game were entirely inappropriate and a risk to his fellow players, managers, coaches, staffs, and families. So PCR is the most accurate test, but you can see the challenge with it. The availability of antigen tests can be helpful, but only in very certain circumstances. Be careful about the conclusions that can be drawn, especially from a single test. And be careful about anywhere that advertises rapid, accurate COVID tests. Ask what kind of test you're getting. And if it's an antigen test and the result is negative and they don't recommend a PCR to follow that, ask why not. Be well and be careful. Remember, act to protect those you care about. It just so happens to also protect you and everyone else, especially right now. And maybe one day I'll tell you why Chipper Jones from the Atlanta Braves owes his Major League Baseball career and Hall of Fame status to me.